With me is Sebastian Payne, online editor with The Spectator. He thinks UKIP has to be taken seriously because they attract such a broad coalition of voters. In Westminster, we've got John Rentoul, columnist for The Independent on Sunday, who says UKIP is unlikely to make a breakthrough in next year's general election, even if they top the polls in this month's European vote. Very good morning to you both, gentlemen. Sebastian, I mean, increasing numbers of voters are clearly taking UKIP very seriously indeed, but it must be said they don't have fleshed out policies beyond Europe and immigration, so it must be on this intangible issue of trust and things like that.
I think there's a very good point in that if you look up and down the country, there's going to be millions of voters who are going to be putting the tick beside UKIP next week. And there's lots of reasons for that. Once upon a time, maybe it was the EU, whereas now it's this huge anti-political sentiment. And the big question is, which no one, not even Nigel Farage, knows the answer to, is what happens after the European elections. Do they keep their support up high? Because last time they went from 17 to 3%. So it's going to be very interesting to see if they can keep that forward and become a party that people will vote for MPs in Parliament.
Oh, well, let's push that forward. Well, John Rentoul, you think they will fade like last time round, do you?
Well, no, I don't think they will, actually. But I think they'll do extremely well in the general election. I think we saw some evidence from the British election study last week, which suggested that UKIP voters might stick with UKIP rather more than last time. But even if they get 14, 15% in the general election, they will get between 1 and none seats. So they, after the general election, they will cease to be an important party, because after the general election, either Labour will win, in which case the Conservatives will become Eurosceptic, or the Conservatives will win, in which case they're offering a referendum on Europe, and there's no point in having UKIP.
I mean, so Sebastian, in effect, it's our political system, the first past the post system, that will tell against UKIP in the end in a general election.
Well, I think there's a certain element of that, but as John said, there's a big uncertainty to what is going to happen. That, if they come first in the European elections, which is your poll, because if they've passed the margin of error, then they will have a significant effect on the Conservative Party, on the Labour Party. They cannot ignore these millions of people crying for help. That's what UKIP are listening to.
What effect do you think they will have, John Rentoul, on the major parties? Because as our poll also shows there, the trend where UKIP are getting their increasing support now, a lot of that is coming from the Labour Party as well.
Well, a little bit recently, but I mean, most of UKIP support, if it comes from any of the other parties, comes from the Tories. I mean, it tends to come from people who haven't voted before and so on. But I mean, it is essentially a Tory protest vote. It will have an effect on the Conservative Party. I mean, that is the big question after the European elections next week, to what extent the Conservative Party takes its head off and runs around in little circles. But I think the Conservative Party understands, actually, that for UKIP to be doing this well a year away from a general election, and for the Tories to be only 3 points behind Labour on average in the general election voting intention polls, I think the Conservatives understand that if they're disciplined and stick together, then they can still win the general election, despite the fact that UKIP have taken so many votes from them.
OK, well, if they're disciplined, do you think they can, Sebastian Payne? Let's throw in the Newark by-election coming up. Of course, Nigel Farage decided not to stand in that, but they can still send a big shot across the bows of the Conservatives in particular in that by-election. That could keep them running around in little circles like headless chickens, as John Rentoul was suggesting there.
Absolutely. One thing that John said is that they're a Tory protest vote. I think that might have been true a year or so ago, but what we've seen is the forgotten, left-behind, working-class vote that feel the other political parties don't speak to them, don't cater for them anymore. And the question is, how do the other parties bring back that vote? How do they appeal to these people who just feel that Labour, the Tories and the Lib Dems have nothing for them anymore? But as you said, with the Newark by-election, it would be interesting to see, do they come second? Do they even come first? And how that affects the other parties and how they react.
But John Rentoul, those defining issues for UKIP, which are applied at this moment, they don't go away, do they, come 2015? It's almost certain, isn't it, there'll be more issues of trust and expenses and things like that with MPs or some of the peers, and, of course, immigration and Europe. They're set to stay.
Well, I'm not sure about that, Dermot. I mean, I think they do go away to a certain extent. I think if the economy recovers to the extent that people start to feel it in their pockets, I think they'll be less worried about immigration. They'll be less worried about the problems of the Eurozone. And you know, the question of trust in politicians will become less important to them as the general election approaches. So I think UKIP are finished in the medium term. I mean, obviously they'll do very well next week. They might even win the Newark by-election, although I don't think so. But after that, it's very difficult to see what the point of the party is. And I think, you know, in 5 years' time, we'll have forgotten who Nigel Farage is.
Well, OK, quite a prediction. Only time will tell on that one. John Rentoul and Sebastian Payne, thank you both very much indeed.